All right, I got the hang of it that time.
Yeah, I got new stuff in there. I was checking that out.
I'm getting there. So if you just joined us and you're watching the Church Safety Guys, welcome. I'm James, and I'm joined tonight by Paul. We are down a guy tonight. He is on the road somewhere in Texas. No, Mike kind of got caught up with some traffic, and I think it was a little bit of protesting traffic. So he's safe. He and his family were out driving around, but he kind of got caught up in that tonight. So we appreciate you keeping him, and also Paul and I in your prayers. We both have been pretty busy lately with chaplain stuff and that sort of thing. Last night, I actually had the opportunity to almost go downtown, kind of on the edge of downtown Columbus. And there was a family that was displaced by a fire. And so I went down there, and thankfully the fire wasn't connected to the riots or any protests or anything. It was just an accidental fire. But to get to where they were, I kind of had to go through some of that area, and I was very grateful. They actually had the entire every entrance to the city was blocked off by a cruiser, and so definitely Paul mentioned it earlier, but definitely keep those folks, guys and gals, in your prayers, as it seems like a lot of different states are dealing with that type of situation at the moment. So but if you joined us, welcome. Thanks for hanging out with us. If you give StreamYard the permissions when you click on the site, then when you comment, it kind of helps us see who's commenting, and it forwards that to us. And you're more than welcome to like and share this post and visit. We also, the day after we do a recording, we put it up on YouTube. So you're welcome to go check out our YouTube channel if you missed one of the past broadcasts. And then we also, on our Church Safety Guys Facebook page, we actually have everything organized by episode. And so if you're looking for a particular topic, you can shoot Paul or I an email, and we can kind of direct you into a past selection of episodes. So thanks for hanging out with us and joining us. Run through here real quick. Hey, Dave, welcome. Emily, Simon, Osmo. I'm just going to throw that out there because I do.
Osmo.
I'm messing with him, but I will give him a shout out because I told him I would check out his Who I Became series, and he's got some great podcast interviews with folks on there, and he's put a lot of time and energy into that. And I was listening to one today from well, I don't know if I want to give that away or not. No, it was kind of funny. I was listening to Simon sent me one that he just did with Paul, and so I'm like out hiking on a trail with my daughter listening to this podcast, and I'm like, you never told me that, Paul. You never said that. What? But no, Paul will actually be on there, I think in a few days or so. So yeah, definitely want to check.
I think he messaged me. It was tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Central Time. It was going live. So
was it? Okay. Yeah, I supposedly he's going to get me on there at some point. I guess next week we're going to talk about it. But Simon's a great guy and does a great job with interviewing and asking really unique and interesting questions. So you definitely want to check that out if you have the opportunity to. So tonight we're actually going to have a special guest with us, and we've kind of talked about this all month, but the book of the month that Paul and Mike have actually been doing started this month, where we were encouraging folks to check out resources along with our resources. And let me see if I have actually a picture of it here. So this is what it kind of looks like. But we actually have Ron joining us this evening, the author of Keeping Your Church Safe. And he's been doing church safety for a long time. And unfortunately, I didn't connect the dots in my head. I went to a conference and I saw his book and I thought it was great. And we've given that to a few of you folks. But then when we were talking to Carl Chen a few weeks ago, he said, you need to call Ron and get Ron on here because he's the guy that you want to talk to. So he was gracious enough to join us. So I'm going to pull him in here. And how are you doing, sir?
Doing great, James. Thanks. Good to see you and Paul.
Well, thanks for joining us tonight. I know it's pretty crazy sometimes playing email back and forth and trying to get everything connected with the world of technology, but we're grateful for you to spend a little bit of time with us. And why don't we go ahead and open, and we'll just ask you, your background, and it's kind of a unique one. How did you get started, and then how did you get involved in church safety? We'll throw that out there.
Yeah. It's a pretty interesting story. I joined the Honolulu Police Department in 1968, if you can imagine. That's where the gray hair comes from. But it's a long time ago. But I was with law enforcement for about 9 years with the Honolulu PD. That's where I grew up. I grew up in Hawaii. And the Hawaii County PD, it's another island. And my last 2 years, I was with the state of Massachusetts as a special state police officer, I guess you could call it. I was a department head for the Department of Mental Health. So you raise your right hand, you sign a form, and you become a state trooper. I was like, wow, this is easy. But it was just because of my law enforcement background, and it was only a large mental health facility in Massachusetts. Okay. So I worked for it for 2 years, and then I got out of law enforcement totally. Got into all kinds of things, and got into, of all things, the pizza business. And that's what brought me to Louisville, Kentucky, is Papa John's Pizza many years ago. They were a very small company at the time. I applied for a job in their training department. Excuse me. And during the interview, they found out I had a law enforcement background. So they were looking for someone that could run their safety and security department for the company. They didn't have anybody. So they hired me, and I spent 5 years there. Now, to get into church security again, what happened was, while there, this is a kind of funny story. Our church, which is a fairly large church, and at the time was running 10 or 12,000 members, did not have a security team. One of the people on staff found out what I did. They said, why don't we put a team together? So we put a volunteer team of myself, former PD guys, and some current PD guys. And so we started a team of 5 or 6 of us. And one of the things that we did was our senior pastor would speak out of town. And so we would drive him. Don't tell anybody I'm saying this, but he was a very poor driver. And so we would drive him. And occasionally I got the privilege. So we went to Indiana one evening. He spoke at a church. And on the way back, we were talking. We had just told the church that we needed somebody on staff full-time as a security director. So myself and the other guys drew up the proposal, drew up the job description, the whole thing, and submitted it. And on the way back, he said, listen, Ron, I want you to take that job. And I said, Bob, no, I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. I'm not interested because, I've seen the back of the curtain. I'm not interested. Sometimes you do that. But no, I didn't want to work for the church. I said I'd volunteer as long as he wanted me to. And then, of course, this is what you always want a pastor to hear. Right, Paul? This is what he's going to say. He's going to say, I'm going to pray about this.
Right.
Yeah. So 30 days later, out of the clear blue, I popped my computer on at work and my job's been eliminated.
Oh, wow.
30 days. So needless to say, I needed to find work. So the Papa John's was in transition at the time, and it was time for me to leave. It's one of those things. I didn't see God's hand in it, but it was. And so I went out, tried to find work. And of course, when God says no, he means no. And I mean, for 3 months, I couldn't earn a dime. I couldn't flip a burger. I could make a taco. No one would hire me. And so I finally went to the pastor and I said, Bob, I said, I need to eat. So we're going, I need a job. And he says, great. So I told him, I'll give you 1, maybe 5 years. I ended up being there 19. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So that was the story of how I got back into it. And when they hired me, like I said, there was no security department. We were just ready to move from a 2,500 seat sanctuary to a 9,000 seat sanctuary. Nothing was in place. We had no cameras, anything. And so we had to start from scratch. I did. And so a year and a half, I was by myself and then hired somebody. And then eventually we had a small staff, a couple of 3 people, and then mostly used volunteers over the time I was there. But I can remember the first month or two going through the internet, picking the phone up, calling all over the country. And I think I found 4 guys that was doing what I was doing. And I mean, it was church security didn't exist back then. We were kind of making our way through it. And, Carl Chin, who you had on your show, was one of the pioneers, because of the incidents and stuff that happened at his church years ago. And he and I get to know each other and met each other. And he's one of the great people in our industry because he has really spread the word the right way. And he's treating it as a ministry. Amen. And that's what we do. It's a total ministry. But that's how I got into it.
It's kind of interesting that you touch on ministry, because that's kind of how, honestly, that's kind of how Paul and I got started with the church safety guys and the social media group. And I think for myself, I was kind of frustrated to a point with, it seemed like a lot of the instruction that was available out there was all about tactical training. And we had, the church that I go to, we have about 800 to about 1,500 on large events and stuff like that. So it flexes pretty readily. But we had we had 2 teams. I was actually the director of the medical team, and then we had a gentleman who was a police officer that was over the main team, and he kind of stepped down. And stepped away, and I approached the pastor and the senior pastor and leadership, and I said, I have kind of this idea about bringing everybody together and making one cohesive team. The church is growing. We really need this. And the pastor kind of pushed back to me, and he said, what's your vision for this ministry? And so that really kind of made me think, I had to kind of step back and say, okay, this is a ministry, because most of the people that do this aren't paid, especially if it's a smaller church. Sure. And so, one of the things that kind of stuck in my mind was, so often we get called to do other things. We get called to minister to people. We get called to pray with people, and all of that. And so that really kind of pushed actually both Paul and I and Mike to an extent to say, look, we have to be handling this like a ministry because of the church and what the church does and their goal. I don't get suited up and go to church every Sunday for the job, for the sake of it. And so, I joke around a lot about, with Paul and the other guys at my church about, when somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I want to be on your security team," and then the second thing out of their mouth is, "Do I get a gun?"
Right.
And I'm like,
Right. Oh yeah, I hear that all the time. Yeah.
No, we're gonna pass on that,
Yeah.
because and then I tell them statistically that 80% of what we deal with is medical. It's a medical related emergency and that sort of thing.
Agreed.
And so
Agreed.
it's kind of interesting, I think, and we get approached by churches often that do listen to the broadcast and that we interact with, that will ask us, and they'll say, well, this is what we have for a budget or training. What do we do? How do we get started? And Paul and I joke about how we started 12, 15 years ago. There wasn't even YouTube out, there wasn't even a YouTube video.
No.
So
I'm sorry, you mentioned the medical team, and they were also under my control. And when people ask me, like in a church of 300-400, how do we get started? And one of the things they always say is, the leadership of the church does not agree with me. How do we do this? Because the word security team, I mean, it's getting more and more common, but still there's a lot of churches out there that, the leadership just said, no, we're not going to do this. I tell them, form a medical team first. Because when they see how you respond and how you take care of that, and what you're doing to protect and provide safety and medical assistance, then it's real easy to transition to, like, we're going to just expand the safety team to include some of our security guys. It's real easy, and it works, and especially in a small church where you may have some pushback. Because when I came on board a very large church, there was tremendous pushback because they never had a security person. They never had an incident. And so they said, we don't need a security person. So one of the things that occurred, and I'll tell you a quick story, and I've got many of them, but one of the things that occurred is, we went in this very prayerful. And I just told a bunch of people and friends and family, I said, I need prayer, because I honestly don't know what I'm doing in this huge facility. I've got a background in private security, a background in public law enforcement, but I have nothing in church security. And so we prayed about it, and God brought the people. He brought the first team in, and that was really great. And so we moved to our new facility. Mind you, this was the first week that we were open. So we had thousands and thousands of extra people show up that couldn't get into the sanctuary for the first service. And I had placed my security people strategically in place, and most of them were volunteers, of course, police officers. And I can remember all the TV stations were there filming, because it's such a big event for a town. And during the service, the two pastors were up there speaking. A guy in the balcony stands up and starts screaming and protesting. And and God is good, because sitting right behind him is an off-duty police officer. I mean, right behind him. I'm like, Lord. But of course I didn't know at the time. All I hear is my radio going crazy. And so we're running up there, and the officer had given him about 20 seconds of fame and yanked him out, placing handcuffs on him. And he wanted to know, he wanted a police officer. And I said, well, everybody's touching you as a police officer. There were 3 or 4 of them. And so the cameras came out, and they followed us. And this was before I had a protocol to take a person was arrested. We took him out the front door to a marked police car. The cameras followed him. And getting in the car, one of my officers put his hand on his head and put him in the car and says, now, don't ever come back. And then he looked at me, and he looked at the guy, and he says, unless you're coming to service. But, the ministry, it's a ministry. I kept telling him it's a ministry. But they interviewed him when he got out of jail the next day. And they said, what do you remember? And he said, I don't like getting arrested. He didn't think he was going to get arrested. And so when that made the news, it set the tone for the church, and it set the tone for our ministry, because then everybody knew that we were there for the specific purpose to keep everybody safe.
Praise God.
And Now, we did arrest a bunch of people over my years that I've been there because we've had officers on the premises, but no one has gotten up since then to scream and holler at the service.
I wanted to throw two quick comments on that. One, I have been amazed at how many churches have a story like that. Now yours, that's really up there because you had cameras and everything. But God, I think God makes appointments. We all know that, and He will put things in place where people will see. Oh, that's why we have a safety team. And I think we all have stories like that at our church where people have come up later and said, wow, I never thought this. I thought this was a club, the Cool Kids Club or something. And now here you guys are doing something awesome. And then I had a friend of mine share something, Ron, that you might find interesting about life. And he said to me, he said, Joseph in the Old Testament, raised in agriculture, abducted by his brothers, sold as a slave, goes into the prison system, goes into government, second only to the Pharaoh. And he said, if you look at that, he understood agriculture. He understood their slave trade. He understood the home in Egypt. He understood the prison system in Egypt. And then he went on to be second only to Pharaoh, and he was able to manage all of the government. And he said, if you look at his life and you don't realize what God was doing, you're like, wow, this poor guy. And he spent a long period of time. I'm afraid if I had gone before Pharaoh after I had been forgotten in prison, and Pharaoh would have been like, so you interpret dreams? I'd have been like, I'm your man. And he's like, no, God interprets dreams. I mean, he's my hero. Yeah. But I think of your story of law enforcement to corporate security to church security. God was grooming you because you cover, in my opinion, the two most valuable gambits. Like a friend of mine and I were talking today at this class. It isn't often that military grade training comes in too handy in church. You don't tend to storm down the aisle and storm a room or something. And it's great to have that skill set, but the corporate security, which deals a lot with law and different things and whatever. And then here's the law enforcement side in beautiful Hawaii. That's wow. And I mean, I'm a little jealous. And then put you in this church, and then you were like, you had a Jonah moment, and you're like, nope. And God's like, all roads lead here. So
exactly.
That's
it's really cool. And I'm not the only one. There's other guys out there. I mean, Carl is one. There's others, and that God has brought to a place. I've been in many conferences where I've gotten up and spoken, and people have come up to me during a break or before or after and says, I've had this idea, like you did, James, going to the pastor and says, I think we need to form a security team or a medical team or whatever. And then the next question to me is, but I don't think I'm the guy. And I said, you know what? You're already here at the conference. You're already here at the conference. I think God's already tapped you on the shoulder. And so, normally our pastor would say, well, great, because you're in charge. And great idea. So I think you got to listen. You got to listen to the Holy Spirit, and you got to really pay attention and be aware. And if he's putting that on your heart, if somebody from a small church is watching this and they may be thinking about that, I think it's time to act. Because, you never want to say, I should have done that before something happens. God does everything for a reason and a purpose. And if he's brought you to this point where you're watching this broadcast and saying, I need to do something, go do it.
And people think because it's a small church, we had this conversation recently with in an interview that's coming down the pipe, James. But people think because they're in a small rural church that nothing will ever happen. And I had a conversation with some folks from a small church near me, and I'm in an area that has these little communities, some of which are below 1,000. And this guy was talking about the fact, and they weren't thinking about it from a security standpoint, but they had a lady about 2 Sundays ago that she came charging in the door, and it was their first Sunday back. And she comes charging in the door, bam, opens the doors, and she's like, I want to know where you guys get off. And I'm thinking she's mad about COVID. Sure. She's like, a couple of days ago, there was a dog out here that got hit by a car, and I had to take it to the veterinarian, and I had to pay for the bill. And where were any of you? That's your job. You're supposed to be Christians. And somebody goes, well, ma'am, I don't know if you realize this. No one's here during the week. And somebody else goes, well, maybe God had you there to take the dog to the veterinarian. And she was just kind of like, and I guess she kind of just left. But I would look at that as a wake-up call to go, this lady just surprised us. And if she'd been surprised I got a gun, they'd have been in trouble.
Yeah, every time something happened at our church, whether it's a minor little thing, we'd have sit down, a couple of us, and say, okay, what did we learn from that?
Amen.
Is the Lord teaching us that maybe something here? So, and we'll never know. I mean, we're in this as a ministry, but we'll never know until we go home on what was prevented to save people's lives.
Amen.
I mean, you talk about small churches. I mean, Southern Texas. I mean, that's a small church. A lot of people died there that day. I mean, things of that nature. So small churches have to really start thinking, what do I need to do to protect our people?
Amen.
And, it's just not locking the doors anymore. We talk about guns. We talk about things like that, joking about guns. But somebody's got to carry it. And somebody's got to be trained properly.
Yep.
More and more states now are dropping these concealed carry classes. Anybody can carry if you're adult age. But I tell people all the time, the same thing, James. They used to come up to me and say, hey, I got my concealed carry here. I'm carrying. I want to join your team. And what training have you done? Well, I went to the class. Sure. So you shot 20 bullets and you hit the target 11 times from 7 yards. Well, no. We got lawns to mow, we got flowers to plant, we got windows to clean. I can find you a spot.
Well, and that's you kind of touched on that, which is also an excellent point, and that's that just because and I've had folks similar to that come up to me and they'll say, well, I'm not real proficient, but I want to help. Maybe they're a veteran. A lot of times we'll see veterans come, but they'll have a protector mindset. And so they'll come in and they'll say, I just want to serve, I want to help however I can. Or maybe they're not physically capable of doing one ministry anymore. So we've gotten to the point of actually going back to where I kind of a few years ago, I kind of started asking the question, well, who's going to do what we do when we're gone?
Yep.
Right. So we need to be proactive in raising the next generation.
Right.
And so I partnered with our youth pastor and I said, now obviously every situation that we deal with isn't going to be, it's not always a PG situation. I can't always have a minor with me with some of the things I've dealt with. But at the same time, if someone has an interest, and we have several younger people right now that are very beneficial. I mean, there are so many different things that they can help with, from traffic directing to watching cameras to just being eyes and ears. So that's absolutely a good point. Just because somebody doesn't fit the necessarily Rambo tactical
and
tactical mode.
And sometimes you may not want them. Paul, you mentioned early on that, running into a big room and just tackling somebody, that mindset is okay when something goes down.
Right.
But for the most part, things like that just don't happen in churches. Very few and far between.
Yeah.
So we have to train our people in skills on how to talk to people. And prime example, we had a policy when I was there, it's changed since I've left, where no one was allowed to carry a weapon on our property except law enforcement officers. And because the resource and the size of our church, and I knew that when we had 4,000 people in the service, there were a couple hundred people having guns. I knew that. Mm-hmm. So we would train our ushers to spot it, and if they spot it, to give us a call. And I was usually the guy that would show up and talk to the person. And you can't be heavy-handed. You got to be careful. You got to learn to talk to them, because first of all, you're representing the church. Second of all, it's a ministry. And third of all, you may be pushing a visitor out that may never come back to church. So what you want to do is you want to go, hey, you shake their hand. You say, first of all, are you a law enforcement officer? And if they say no, then I talk to them really nice. And I say, you know what? Guns are not allowed in our church. If you don't mind, can you put it in the car and come back? And so that's how we dealt with it. Now, occasionally we'd have someone, and I've had this happen where they've actually pulled the Second Amendment out of their pocket and go, "Hey, here's the Second Amendment," and I go, "I agree with you. I've been there, done that, carried the badge. I understand. I said, but this is private property.
Exactly. And that's covered in the Constitution too.
Yeah, and a lot of churches don't realize they can do this. But, I tell him, then the next step is, please put it in the car. If you don't, then this officer here is going to tell you to leave the property. And if you don't, you get arrested for trespassing. Yeah. And they go, okay, I'll put it in the car. So, yeah, I mean, I talk to many churches, and the smaller churches especially don't realize, that, you mean I can do that? Well, yeah, it's like your home. You can ask somebody to leave too.
Yeah.
It's funny. I've had that conversation multiple times, and in Ohio, Ohio law is actually, it's illegal unless you have permission from the place of worship. And so I've had that conversation where, several times with people that'll come in. We had one gentleman a couple months, well, probably a couple of years ago now. He came in, sat down in the back row, and someone commented to me. They said, he's not a regular attender. I thought I noticed maybe a holster or something under his jacket. So we had someone walk up to him, and he had a 38 fall out of his pocket, out of the holster, and fall onto the seat. And then it rolled from the seat onto the floor. And to his benefit, I mean, he was just a visitor. To his benefit, it was during the music portion of the service. So, the only person, yeah. the only person that really noticed was the guy that was sitting next to him, which, his eyes got like this big, and he's like having a heart attack because he's like, where did that come from, type thing. But it is interesting to kind of go back to what you mentioned earlier with that first moment where you had to remove that guy. It's interesting to me how I know it's happened at my church, it's happened at Paul's church, but every time you get just a tad bit of people questioning, like, do we really need this? Right. It's almost like, God allows something to happen, and something happens where it's like, wait a second. Oh, okay. I mean, our story was we had a gal that was in her 80s collapse on Easter Sunday. The church was completely full. She was on the stage in front singing, and she collapsed and went unconscious. Right. And so it was a medical emergency, but we were able to move her off of the stage, to a back hallway where we could treat her and call for an ambulance and that sort of thing. But that was, I mean, in a nutshell, that was ours, where, people looked at it and said, hey, there's a group of people that are responding. Right. And, we still have moments. I mean, unfortunately, when things happen at other churches, often individuals will come up to me while I'm there, and they'll say, hey, thank you so much for, the ministry that you're doing. Or, sometimes leadership will come to me and they'll say, are we covered, or what, what's our policy on this? How do we handle this? But, right. Much like what you said, every time something happens, we sit down and we look at how we handled it, kind of like critiquing, afterwards, what did we do good? What did we do bad? And, how can we change things or make things better? And one thing that a lot of times people don't really grasp all of, although, like you said, it's more common today, is that when you deal with that large amount of people, I grew up in a town of 1,500 people in the wintertime and 2,500 in the summer, because we were a lake community, right? Yeah. So, when I talk to churches, or when I think about our own church, I look at it, we have, on a concert on a holiday Sunday, we have 1,500 people. That's a town. And you, from that perspective, you have all of these resources in a town that's, that are set aside for that. But so often in churches, there's just been a blind eye to hey, you know what? We should have an AED. We should have resources because of, the level of just sheer population that we minister to and we see on a regular basis. So
Yeah, I think you're right. One of the things about the medical team is that when we were at this, and again, this is all scalable because of our large facility, but we average a medical call per service, and we had 3 services every weekend. We would transport about 20 or 25 by EMS every year. And while I was there, we had 3 people we lost. So, and that's with an AED and medical team. So, but the thing about the medical team, again, I go back to ministry. Our medical folks were all volunteers. We had 1 nurse we paid for the children, but the rest of the team was all volunteers. And I can't tell you how many times when they had someone in our little medical room, when I'd open the door, they'd be on their knees praying with this person. And it could be a visitor. And the impact that was felt was tremendous. We had a lady who died, elderly lady who died one night during our Easter pageant. And the doc and me had ministered to her earlier, and she said she was fine. And then, of course, we get a call and she had a cardiac arrest. So she died on our property. They were not members. They were visiting from another part of town. And so we reached out through our care ministry. We actually hosted the funeral there. We did all of that for the family. And, that sent really a good message in the community that, we care about people and we have people in place to help. And I can remember talking to the son of this lady who just couldn't say thank you enough because he saw us working on him, trying to keep her alive. I mean, it was just incredible. But it is a ministry, and whether you're a church of 50 or 500 or 5,000, you're going to experience those medical calls, and you got to know how to respond. Now, you mentioned the AED, and I don't know if you brought this up in a previous program, but I always get the question is, we're 100 members, we can't afford an AED. It's $1,100 or whatever the cost is now. And I was on a webinar with the Department of Homeland Security's number 2 man. And he talked about this program called UASI, UASI. It's an initiative for grant money for nonprofits. And guess what? Houses of worship are included. If it reference to security like cameras, AEDs fall under this, locks, anything like that, that money is a grant money from the government. And it's available every year through each state's Homeland Security office. And all a church has got to do is call them or email them and say, listen, I want to be on the list. When that money comes out, let me know so I can apply to get some of it. And I did a conference and teaching in Florida about a year ago. And I mentioned this, and they didn't know anything about it. And a month after I had left, I get an email saying the money just came out and we applied. So, they were trying to get some new cameras, and it's free. It's grant money.
Sure. And that's a great resource. We've looked into that in Ohio several times for our church, and we haven't been able to take advantage of it. But the other interesting dynamic with that is that things are a lot less expensive than than they used to be. I mean, I was an EMT firefighter for about 10 years. And, I can remember an AED being somewhere up around 20,000, and even the ambulances didn't have them, back then. But
when I came in the scene, it was between 3,000 and 4,000.
Sure. And, even with that, I mean, we actually had someone, because our building is I think it's about 55 years old. We actually had a family come forward, and they actually donated money at the end of the year for 1 year it was for an AED. Another year we had another family come forward and donate money for radios. 1 year a family came forward and donated money. We were upgrading and installing an access control system for our children's department. Right. And so they actually said, well, here's here's some, and we want you to use it for the safety ministry of the church. And outside of having the safety team on a budget line item show up in the annual budget meeting of the church,
I know what you mean. Yeah.
I think that, one of the pastors came to me and I was almost crying, because I'm like, well, bless them, thank you so much for thinking that this is important enough, to step in and contribute and say, hey, this is for you guys. So, it's interesting, but, when you get to that point, and, a lot of times, again, going back to what you said earlier, we get that question often too. How do I handle leadership that doesn't like security, doesn't want that? And I think oftentimes it really does take solid, consistent ministry work for a long period of time, to develop that trust. And, different things happening to show that, that you're not just fooling around. It's not just a club. It's, an active ministry. And, what we found over the years, it's a challenge, but once you get to that point where you have the trust established, then it's an easier road for sure.
Well, I have a little story about that. I was asked to speak at a local church here while I was on staff at our church, and to come in and teach and train. They didn't have a security team, but they had an usher group of around 20. So I always believe the ushers and greeters are frontline security anyway. So he asked me to come in, and I get there and he says, "Oh, by the way, the pastor doesn't agree with you at all. He hates security, doesn't want you here." And I'm like, I'm kind of like in the building,
Right.
And so he says, I said, "So what do you want me to do?" He says, "Well, I want you to teach the class." I said, "Fine." So I go into this big conference room, and here's these 20 ushers. And at the very opposite end of the table from me is the senior pastor. And for 2 hours, I taught for 2 hours. And the whole 2 hours, he sat back with his arms folded and just stared at me. And I'm trying not to pay attention. I'm just doing what I was called to do. And but God is good, because toward the end of this thing, I don't know why I said it, but I did. And I came to the conclusion. I was talking about something, and I said, "Now, guys, understand that this is spiritual warfare." I said, "We're dealing with the enemy who wants to come in and destroy and everything in our churches and to divide us. And he does that in a number of different ways. And one way is to come in and cause confusion, some security issues, some safety issues, even medical issues that we're not prepared for." I said, "But it is spiritual warfare. Just remember that." And after the class, the pastor walks up, shakes my hand, and he goes, "I get it." I said, "Now I understand."
Praise God.
Yeah, so
that's good.
I use that a lot now. So I use that a lot.
Well, it's funny because Paul and I both say, and we've said before independently of each other, that if you think that you're above being interrupted or distracted in that service, when Jesus himself was interrupted by Satan, and different things happened to him in his earthly ministry, there's a disconnect there. There's a problem. You are not above the Son of God preaching a message.
No, you need to get a bunch of prayer warriors around your ministry that pray for you all the time, especially when you're doing what you do on the weekends during service. There got to be a few people praying for you. There got to be somebody in the church praying for you while you're ministering, because that's when you need the protection. I mean, going back to that originally story where we arrested the guy in the very first service, one of the things that we felt a lot of pressure, especially when I came on, was people didn't want. I'd walk into a room in the staff meeting, and no one, everybody would get quiet. No one would talk. And I'm like, okay, this would be a fun place to work. But right after that first arrest, I remember the volunteer guys running up to me. They said, we did it. We let them know. God did, but he let them know that we're needed. So, I said, hey, that's just an answer to prayer. That's all that is.
Talking about covering things in prayer. And then I think we have a question, James, that you might want to pose to Ron as well. But
Sure.
talking about covering things in prayer, if God doesn't watch over the city, the watchmen watch in vain.
Right.
We prayed to our God and we posted a guard, emphasis on prayer first.
Yep.
And we had a day years ago at our church, and I'll hit two quick anecdotes and then jump back about the power of prayer. God will step in and will guide and will shepherd and will protect, but we got to kind of ask for it. And we had an incident where two guys were mules. They were running from the cops, and they flew into the parking lot. And when they flew into the parking lot, they were going to try to come into our church and hide.
Right.
And as God would have it, I was going outside to get some food for someone whose blood sugar had dropped, medical issue. And I had an elder who was a pistol packing elder and pretty squared away. And he was out there on the phone with his company, talking to his bosses. And we had another gentleman that had stepped out, and he's like 6'8". The guy's a Philistine. And he was on the phone with his wife, who was homesick. And as it was, I think we had 5 people off of my safety team in the parking lot. And these guys, they flew through the parking lot about 50 miles an hour. Boom. Doesn't look right.
Right.
The plates are out of date by several years. They look like they are probably part of our meth community where I was at. And they fly in and they come running towards the doors, like real fast walking. And I'm like, hey, guys, how are you doing? And they look at me like, that's a cop. And so all these red flags are going on.
Oh, sure.
And they see my 6'8" guy standing there by the door. And he's like, looks at him, and they were like, and just bolted. They were like, oh my gosh, it's a giant. And God used that to protect us, power of prayer. And then 2, there's a ministry that I kind of help shepherd some of the ladies. I'm driving through this city near me. And as I'm driving through the city, it just occurred to me, you need to stop off and go visit with them. Out of the blue, I pull in, and they were filming a segment about the business, the ministry. They're driving around, and a drone is following the vehicle.
Yeah.
I'm sitting in the passenger seat of a medical van to set the stage for this. And this homeless guy runs up, probably drugged out of his mind, and lunges and tries to jump up onto the running board and is reaching in the side of the van. And there are a lot bigger people than me, but I'm about 218 pounds and 6'4". And I turned and looked at him, and I was thinking, I'm about to elbow this guy in the face. And he froze like mid-leap and just stopped like, that's not a woman. He had seen them come through 100 times, and it was always women. And I think he thought he was going to strong arm money from them or something. Right. And the lady driving, she's watching the drone. They got a film crew. She's on the phone with one of her people. She goes, I got to go. Somebody tried to jump in my van. And at that moment, I said, I think I realized why God put me here. And she goes, oh, no doubt. And that's the power of prayer. We have people that pray over that ministry, and God just goes, oh, by the way, Paul, I put you in this town for such a time as this. So anyway.
Exactly right.
Well, I was just going to say, 3 years ago, we had a day, we open every team that's scheduled. We open with prayer, and before we go out and we disperse for that service, we all gather together and pray. And then we go to our posts and do our thing. And we had one day I think it was about 3 years ago, where we ended up having some relatives of a Somalian who tried to kidnap someone show up at our church. And the relatives were actually, the gal that he had tried to kidnap actually became a Christian through the ministry of our church, coming to our church, was saved. Her and her family were coming. They had seen her get on one of the church buses, and so they followed the church bus to the church. And the relatives came in, and they were trying to meet with her to ask her to forgive them so that she wouldn't press charges the next day in court with with a relative. And when we figured out what was going on, we partnered with Columbus Police, and we ended up having probably 12 or 13 officers there. 2 detectives working the case showed up, and we were able to graciously pull them out and say, look, what you're doing is actually trying to witness intimidate an individual that's going to court tomorrow, and that's a felony. That's against the law. And so that was just a crazy story in itself. And so that night, because we have a morning and evening service, that evening I went back to the church, and of course that situation with law enforcement took most of the day. Sure. So I was beat, I was exhausted, and I don't usually, a lot of times I won't go to the evening service. And something in my mind that night said, you need to go to the evening service. So I showed up, and one of my good friends who's an usher actually collapsed and stopped breathing. And he actually came up to me, and I asked him, I said, are you feeling okay? You look a little pale. And he's like, oh, I'm fine. And then just completely, like, eyes rolled back in his head, completely just knees buckled, fell on me. And so I started doing, grabbing the AED, trying to, with some other folks, trying to get, compressions going and everything. And, we called, I had one of our safety folks call 911, and there was actually an engine sitting in front of our church at the traffic light. And they had just finished a call. They were actually going back to the station when the call came over, and they interrupted the dispatcher and said, we're right in front of that building, and this is an ALS call. Right. So they literally, within 4 minutes of him collapsing, they were walking in with, their equipment, and, within 8 minutes of him collapsing, an ambulance pulled up behind, and they came in. And what's crazy about it is, it's absolutely what you were saying before. When I look at it, I'm just like, even to this day, I laugh because so much happened that day. Right. Yeah. But at the same time, I'm like, you know what? Everybody was in the right place at the right time, and it wasn't our place in our time. It was God's time. And so when we looked at that, and even to this day, when I look at it, there's too many coincidences. It was a coincidence that there was, an ambulance a block away. It was a coincidence that there were officers a block away, all this stuff. And it's like, you know what, to me, it reaffirmed. And that was kind of the day that really cemented the safety team at our church.
Sure.
But, but at the same time, I look at it and I just say, you know what, the best thing you can do, honestly, is just pray, and, go through your day, but, expect that God is watching and listening, and, he protects and he makes things happen, in his providence. So it's definitely an interesting time. I'm sure after 19 years, you've got some crazy stories.
Some crazy ones. I mean, into Paul's talking about being at the right place at the right time. A lot of times what the Lord will do is, if you pay attention, and I tell everybody I speak to in groups, whether it's 100 or 1,000 people, I say the same thing. I say, just pay attention. If everybody has an innate, God gives everybody this innate feeling, or whatever you want to be alive. I mean, we want to protect ourselves, our family, and all of this. I said, when he infuses you with the Holy Spirit, I believe he gives you an extra measure. And so what you need to do is just use that. So when we talk about in police work, getting more aware or observant, they teach you that for years and years. Your teams also should be the same way, and they should be paying attention. So when they walk down a hallway and they say, you know what, I don't feel comfortable here, I need to go check out, go. Don't wait. That, I think, if nothing's there, that's fine. But I can't tell you the number of times over the years as a police officer and in security, and you guys can tell the same story, that the Lord will lead you like the van. He'll lead you into the right place at the right time.
Amen.
And I mean, I can't tell you how many times that has occurred. So I tell the people from all the teams that show up that I speak to, I tell them the same thing. Just be aware. Listen to the Holy Spirit. When he tells you to do something, go do it.
Yeah. I pray and ask God, and so it's my fault when it happens, but I pray and ask God, I'm like, use me. And I believe he made me to protect other people, and I believe he made me to minister to other people. And I cannot count how many times I have pulled up to something that I was there and protected someone, helped someone. And it got to the point that I actually had a police officer friend turn to me, and he basically said, you're a poop magnet. And I started laughing, and I said, no, it's my fault. I pray about this. And I don't know how many times I have been somewhere. A lady was asleep in the road, high as a kite, had laid down on the road on a curve where she was going to get hit.
Right.
and I pulled up to an intersection. You can take it or leave it, but I was going to go left because that's the way I always go. It's a big horseshoe, and the Lord's like, go right. And I'm like, okay. And I pull up to the next junction, and there's a lady laying there in the road asleep. She didn't fall down. She laid down and went to sleep there. And I blocked her body with my SUV and got an ambulance called. She had smoked methamphetamine and then drank gasoline.
Gracious.
And I was like, I think we need to get you an ambulance.
I did executive protection for 15 years, watching over a Christian lady speaker, and large arenas, churches all over the country. And to that point, you really got to pay attention. You really got to pay attention, because if you're not paying attention and listening, it's going to get you before you see it. So my prayer was always, Lord, show me before it happens.
Amen.
Show me before it happens. If it's coming, I need to know. Show me a sign. Show me the movement, whatever you do. And so that was my prayer. And so for 15 years, she never got harmed. So that's when I retired and walked away from that, I said, thank you, Lord. But yeah, that's something that everybody needs to be aware of.
For sure. One of the actually, if I go back just a bit, one of the questions that someone asked about, you had mentioned about the grant through the Homeland Security, and I think they were asking if anyone knew if a 501c3 status was necessary for that, or if it was available. I think it is necessary, but I'm not 100% sure.
I thought when I listened to him speak, he said nonprofits.
Right.
Yeah. So if you're a nonprofit, you qualify. If you're for profit, then you're not going to be able to qualify. And so, yeah, that's a designation that he used.
I know a lot of times we've had questions before, like from churches and whatnot, that a church won't register as a nonprofit because they don't like the government involvement in that piece. And so, that's just kind of something, unfortunately, you have to make a decision for,
right.
Or your church leadership does. But I will say that, if you're looking for larger resources and you can't take advantage of that grant, a good place to start is look at the people and look at the folks that maybe want to make a special gift, or maybe your local businesses or something like that, where they're willing to contribute that. But
yeah,
Paul, you were going to ask something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question because one of the things I didn't realize, and you just mentioned this, Ron, is you have a background with some EP work. And what I love about that is, and of course, I have not that much background in EP work, but from time to time, the Lord uses me with some executive protection details and whatever. So from the standpoint of churches, we oftentimes run into people with military experience or law enforcement experience. Talk to us about your thoughts on executive protection work and protecting church leadership or the church in general.
I think, first of all, senior ministers, when I talk to leadership of churches, I tell them, first, you got to be friends with, and I was very friendly with our insurance company. So we dealt with a broker who managed our insurance company. So you want to have proper coverages for your leadership people in case something happens. That's number one. Number two is you got to let them know that you're doing executive protection of your pastor. And I think every pastor needs to have somebody, whether it's a friend or someone on the team. A small church may not have somebody, but put an elder, put a deacon, put somebody with them. Two purposes. Number one, we all know security is important, but his integrity is super important. And you know what? His family will love you for that. He may not want it at first, but the way I did it with our pastor, and he didn't want it at first, but I prayed about this, and lo and behold, one Sunday while I was thinking of approaching him, a guy walked up to me and after service, and he shook my hand. He says, "Hey, my name's so-and-so. I'm a Secret Service agent. You need any help?" And I went, "Aha." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I protect the vice president." Aha. So needless to say, we use his resources in teaching us and to bring in the pastor and the associate pastor and have a talk with them on what they needed. So yeah, we provided executive protection for our pastor. He got out of the car, we met him, and we were with him until we put him back in the car.
Okay. Awesome.
We sat behind him in every service. We walked around with him. And now here's the deal. And he said, well, what do I do when I want to talk to a parishioner or a member of the congregation? No problem. I'll step away. I don't need to hear the conversation. Now, what I tell people that I protect, I tell them, all you have to do is look at me for a couple of seconds. I'll interrupt. If the pastor doesn't want that to go any further, his conversation, he'll look at me. He'll give me a look for about 2 seconds. I'll interrupt. I said, I'm sorry, the pastor needs to leave. I'm the bad guy. We go. Yeah. If I mistakenly read that, the pastor says, I'm sorry, Ron, give me another minute or two. That's fine. But that's how we did it. And we never left him alone, really. And you know what? It came back, and we were very confident that when his family came to us, and I can remember his mother, in her 80s, coming to me, and she says, thank you, Ron, for protecting my son.
Hallelujah.
Because she knew that his integrity was important, and security was part of it. But the integrity, as you well know, you see this in the news where pastors fall, but we're not going to let it happen on our watch, not at church.
Well, and just the accusations. Our pastor, he passed away, was one of my best friends for 21 years. And I don't know how many times he would call me or text me late at night and say, I need you at the church in 10 minutes. And of course, I live 7 minutes from that church. I need you at the church in 10 minutes. I've got to go to this hospital, this location, this person. And sometimes it was 2 hours away. And we'd pull almost an all-nighter. And then later somebody would say, boy, he sure is out a lot late at night. And he would say, well, go see Deacon so-and-so. That's Paul Buckner. He's in charge of the security team. Ask him what we did.
Right. And there you go. That's perfect.
It covered the integrity issue. And before he passed, we were up to the point of actually pricing GPS tracking devices for two reasons. One, for integrity, but the abduction of pastors or just keeping track of your church bus in case of something horrible happening, unspeakable happening. We were actually to the point of knowing where they were at all times.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And the last thing I'm going to say about EP is that get some training.
Amen.
Because no one, even if you have it concealed and you train in the guns and all the tactical shooting, protection of somebody's life is completely different. So get some training. And most large police departments and sheriff's departments have somebody on staff now that they have trained. And if not, grab a federal agent or someone. Luckily the Lord brought this Secret Service agent, and he and I have been friends for 20 plus years.
I love it.
But yeah, he literally came in and spent time with the five of us and just taught us the basics. This is what happens. You need a safe room. This is where you go when you take him. This is how you move him. This is how you physically move him. Things where this is where you stand, because we're not three people. We're one person walking around with the pastor. Yeah. And so get some training. That's really important. And so eventually your protectee, the person you're protecting, the pastor, whoever, then will trust you. When that trust is developed, it's much easier. Sure. And the job will become easier. The first few times it's going to be a little difficult, but it's okay.
We have stumbled on something that I get super excited about. Number one, being friends with a Secret Service agent that can teach you some tricks of the trade. I'm drooling about it. Number two, I have formally trained in executive protection, and I've been part of details from a one guy detail to an 8-dot team. Or an
Sure.
And there are really great programs out there to learn from. And I tell you, protecting my wife, how I sit in restaurants, how I stop at stoplights, how I position my vehicle, what I do at drive-throughs, it's affected my entire life positively. But also, if I'm moving through the church body and I see something going on, it completely changes my view of everything, even the exit.
Right. Yeah, I've not been on our team now for almost 3 years, and I cannot worship I'm always the antenna is always up, and my wife has given up talking to me. So, but yeah, it's just the way it is. And the last thing I'll say about that, when you're doing that with the pastor and you're sitting in service, you need to be paying attention to what you're supposed to do. Yeah. If you can tell your wife what the pastor preached about, then you're not doing your job, because you're supposed to be paying attention to everything else.
That's an awesome point.
Yeah. I've got guys. I had a guy on our team who joined our team, and he would be taking notes, and I'm like wanting to throw something at him.
Right.
I preach, you shouldn't be on the team. But no, if you're doing security, do security. And also our cell phones. Oh my. You can go anywhere in the city, in any city you live in, and if a police officer, and I was one, and security guy, I was in a hospital the other day, and a security person, this is what they're doing. I mean, we're tied to our phones. We cannot be looking at our phones. We got to put them up. We got to put them up. Otherwise, we're not looking at anything.
When there's a time to get fed and there's a time to be on guard duty, and and I'm a big dog person. I've had livestock, Pyrenees dogs and similar. One dog will go eat and the other dog goes and stands watch, literally. And they don't go to the food dish as adults at the same time. One goes and sleeps and the other one stands watch. And if something happens, it's like, oof, and then the other dog is up and they go deal with it. And there's a reason that Colonel Grossman calls us sheep dogs.
That's right. That's right.
You know what that's about.
Good point.
Well, I definitely appreciate your time with us tonight. Unfortunately, we're past our time, so I know Paul would love to throw more questions at you, especially about executive protection. That's I can see his ears wiggling as soon as you mention that. So, but thank you very much. Thank you for your service as a officer, and thank you for spending some time with us tonight. And we'd love to have you back on at some point down the road if you're willing and available, and hopefully we didn't wear our welcome too thin.
No, I love it. I love doing this, and you guys do a great work. And like I said, we'll never know what you've done to protect the kingdom. So thank you. I appreciate that. But I'd love to come back anytime. Give me a call.
All right. That sounds great. I will go ahead and pull him out for real quick, and we will wrap up this evening's broadcast. So if you joined us, thank you for spending some time with us. It was great to have Ron on. Is the author of Keeping Your Church Safe, and he's definitely a great resource. He has Oasis Safety, and he's based out of Louisville in Kentucky. And if you are looking for church training or help with your training, your safety or security team, definitely reach out to him. And he's a powerful resource. So I will go ahead and close us tonight in prayer, and then we'll have a quick promo video, and then we'll call it a night. So let's go ahead and pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for this evening. I thank you for the opportunity that we had to chat with another one of your servants. And Lord, I just ask that you would bless the folks that listen to this, that they would be able to glean some from it, and that it would be helpful to them in protecting your flock and keeping your people safe. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right. Let me